"Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." This quote was said by Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, commonly known as the father of the atomic bomb. This was his answer to how he felt after he witnessed the first ever man-made nuclear explosion during the Manhattan Project. Mankind nearly became the destroyer of worlds during the Cold War, where two ideologies were pitted against each other in a battle for dominance in the post-World War II world. This conflict that lasted 50 years, from 1945, right at the end of World War II, to 1991, helped shape the world as we know it today. And of course, it's easy for many to forget that the Cold War ended only 27 years ago. Its effects still have ramifications throughout our modern day and have, as I said, influence and had an effect on many different parts of society and many different great events that we may not even have any idea that they actually did had a large role in. Let's see. Now, just some clarification before we start. I'm going to be saying the word NATO a lot. NATO is an acronym that stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is an alliance that was started at the end of World War II and meant to act as an alliance in order to fight or combat or act as a deterrent against the Soviet Union, or the USSR, which is also another term, mostly the Soviet Union. But the USSR stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Just keep that in mind. And that is the Soviet Union, or the Combloc countries, or the Warsaw Pact. There are many names. So, of course, the Cold War has the word war in it. War often connotes a negative meaning, that there was death, tragedy, violence. And yes, there was. It was a war. It was a conflict. Lives were lost. But the real battlefield of the Cold War was not with a rifle or in a tank. It was on a podium or a stage, speaking into a microphone. The real battles of the Cold War were fought not on the battlefield itself, but in an auditorium or in a press conference. So with that in mind, though the Cold War often has negative views in American society and throughout the world, it is my view that though the Cold War is seen in a negative way, in reality it was good for the United States and for global stability. I will show this in society, how the Cold War improved and helped to improve American society, and also how the Cold War helped to improve the American economy throughout the war. Also, one thing that wasn't mentioned was that how the policy or ideology of interventionism helped to also improve the United States and also improve global stability throughout the Cold War. Now, the Cold War is a very complex and controversial topic, so let's first dive into the history of the Cold War. The Cold War began, as I said, in 1945 with the end of World War II. As one war ended, another one began. American and Russian forces met in the city of Torgau in Germany. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but and the alliance that had held for over 5 years, fighting a war against Axis powers, was gone. There was no longer a need for the liberal democracies, America, Britain, and France, to have an ally, to be allied with the Soviet Union, which was a totalitarian communist regime. So at the end of the war, the sides split and the lines were drawn not soon after. In the late 40s and early 50s, the Iron Curtain fell, and the West and the Soviet Union, which had now encompassed basically all of Eastern Europe, the conflict began in earnest. Now, there is a time period from 1947 to 1957. This 10-year span set the precedent for how many in the United States, or the public in the United States, viewed communism, the Soviet Union, and the whole war in general. This time period was called the Red Scare. As you can probably tell, it's not a very nice time. The Red Scare was a time of great paranoia and fear and anger in the United States populace. This was a time of great paranoia where the United States government actually implemented loyalty tests to see if to ensure the loyalty of government employees. There were anti-communist, there's large, great anti-communist sentiment in the public. And while it may have gone to some sort of extreme, and though it may have gone to a certain extreme, it was, in a way, due to the fact that spying and espionage was a large part of the Soviet tactic in order to gain technology and steal technology from a technologically more advanced United States. Since, of course, we have to consider that at the end of World War II, Europe is devastated. Eastern Europe is devastated. Much of Africa has experienced fighting. Asia is devastated. The main, perhaps the only major industrial power or country, a Western country that has large amounts of industrial power and infrastructure left, is the United States, which was untouched by bombing campaigns and raids. So, as the U.S. already had a great advantage in that sense, the Soviets wanted to catch up. Let's see. All right. Now that we've talked a little bit about the history of the Cold War, let's now get into the topics. My first argument is that the Cold War improved American society. And this may be somewhat hard to believe. How can you connect improvements in society to a war, a 50-year-long conflict, including events like the Korean War or the Vietnam War? How can they improve a society? However, the Cold War is in fact related in many ways to the Civil Rights Movement, or a precursor to the Civil Rights Movement. It is common knowledge that during the mid-20th century, African Americans were not really treated well in the United States. In the South, there were many state laws in force called Jim Crow laws that segregated blacks from whites. These were laws put in place that separated these people groups, and there was latent and systemic racism in the South. But the main issue here was that the government itself had legislature in place that was basically making African Americans second-class citizens. In the 1950s and 60s, when the U.S. was trying to gain allies, trying to grow NATO, trying to grow this alliance in order to act as a deterrent against the Soviets and to contain them, a place for allies that they looked was Africa. The continent of Africa had just gained its freedom, basically. After World War II, or before World War II, it was basically held by imperialist powers, European imperialist powers, Britain and France primarily. After the war, they didn't have the military strength or just capability to maintain them, so many countries in Africa did get their freedom. Of course, now you have all these separate, many countries in Africa that are looking for friends and that are rather mineral rich, resource rich. And they are deciding whether to ally themselves with NATO or the Soviet Union. And of course, America wants those allies in Africa not only to block off the Soviets from getting a foothold in Africa, but also to gain further allies in a possible war if the Soviets do decide to attack. However, there was one major hindrance, however, you might be able to guess it, that the US was making itself out to be a bastion of democracy, promoting freedom and fighting for third-class countries, third world countries perhaps, trying to implement more democracy and such. However, if one looked at within the borders of the United States, there was state mandated and legally mandated racism and segregation. And so many opportunities that the US would have had to gain allies in Africa were unable to go through because the African states were skeptical of the United States because it was a bit hypocritical in its wanting, and it's projecting itself as a bastion of freedom, but treating its own citizens poorly. So this forced the U.S. pressure was put on the U.S. not only from these African nations, but also from other members in NATO, Britain and France, primarily, to help to desegregate America and to allow for more equality to stand. Excuse me. So, where was I? For equality to stand. So there were acts like the Desegregation Act of 1954, which were steps that America took in order to desegregate some schools and to repeal some Jim Crow laws that had been put into place and had been oppressing African Americans for a very long time. And this was a consequence of the Cold War and the conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. Now, moving on to the economy. How did the Cold War benefit the United States economy? How could this conflict benefit the US? Well, the US was trying to gain large amounts of allies during this time in order to gain a defense against the Soviets and act as a deterrent, and also to just limit the expansion that the Soviets could do. So, during this time, the U.S., as I've stated earlier, already had a huge industrial base that was still intact after World War II, perhaps the only one that was still majorly intact. And so there were lots of trade goods, and also, there was large amounts of trade goods and also military arms that needed to be sent out across the seas. And many new NATO members and allies of the United States needed these goods. And the only one who could provide them was really the United States. So the need for American goods and American military aid supplies bolstered and gave new purpose to an already large industrial base and kept that going. In fact, I have a quote from the US Department of State that says that the national gross product rose from 200 million in 1940 to 300 million in 1950 and to more than 500 million in 1960. At the same time, the jump in post-war births, known as the baby boom, increased the number of consumers. More and more Americans joined the middle class. So, due to increased global trade and increased global stability due to American military prominence throughout the world, especially America having a large navy in order to police and keep the seas safe, companies and recovering nations felt safer and more, more, not influenced, but enticed to start international trading ventures. And thus, that's how the Cold War, where a need for trade and military arms to supply allies and to supply consumer goods to other nations, helped in order to act as a deterrent against the Soviet Union, and in order to build up allied countries so that they would be useful allies against the Soviets, and that's how they would benefit. The economy would benefit from the Cold War. And finally, to interventionism. Interventionism is a hotly debated topic. It is often seen, not often seen. Interventionism is a hotly debated topic. The U.S. has intervened throughout the Cold War in several different ways, in several different types. Through perhaps the earliest one during the Cold War is the Berlin airlift, or the rebuilding of Germany and the rebuilding of Japan after the Cold War, after the World War II, excuse me. These nations were war-torn and had lost the war. However, the U.S. intervened into these war-torn nations that, yes, they had defeated, but helped rebuild them, and instituted democracies where they once had been totalitarian governments. And now Germany is the largest economy in Europe, and Japan is a huge technological giant and a very successful nation. these countries were given funds by the U.S. to rebuild themselves and are valuable allies, and were and are valuable allies. Another way the U.S. has intervened for the benefit of the U.S. and also for global stability is in Korea. Korea is a similar situation where there was a split after a colonial overlord had left, basically Japan. After Japan had been defeated, there was a power gap, and two ideologies rose, one of democracy and one of a communist state, a totalitarian communist state. And so these split, and the North had the support of the Soviet Union, and the South did not. So they asked for the support of the South, for the United States, and through NATO. And through that, the South survived the Korean War and was able to be a proud and prospering democratic nation as it is today. Of course, there are always some questions that many people may have. Of course, one of the major counter-arguments or questions someone may have is that Vietnam was not a success. In fact, Vietnam was kind of a failure, in fact. And I would say that, yes, it was a failure. But that does not necessarily invalidate the concept of interventionism in order to stop an aggressive and totalitarian communist regime that is threatening to overtake a democratic nation that has asked for help from the United States. The Vietnam failed because of several ways. It was, in a sense, kind of a perfect storm. It was the first highly publicized war in the history of man, televised, excuse me. There was a strong countercultural movement already existing at the time. And the terrain itself of Vietnam made it very dangerous and difficult to fight, and also that due to its highly televised nature, the military was reluctant to fully commit to Vietnam because of wavering public support. All of this led to a failure, which was Vietnam. And that it may have been a failure, but it does not invalidate all the other successes and the ideology of interventionism. What was the time? 3. Moving now to a counter-argument to a possible question or counter-argument to how the Cold War positively influenced the American economy. That it is, as I've said throughout the speech, that American military technology and ability to put out high-quality military equipment and to produce a lot of it was important throughout the war. And it has generated a rather large military-industrial complex. And some say that the complex has become far too influential in the United States and has degraded the military. However, I believe that it was necessary in the Cold War to have a large military-industrial complex that could churn out a lot of equipment to supply not only a large US military, but also all of the United States' allies, all of the NATO partners who wanted US equipment because it was, well, the best in the world and was the most technologically advanced. And so, at the cost of perhaps a rather influential military-industrial complex, I believe that it is still a benefit for the United States that perhaps it was large. The military-industrial complex has become rather large and perhaps a little bloated, but that is it's not away the advantage and the need for U.S. military equipment throughout the Cold War and throughout the world during the Cold War in order to better equip our allies and ourselves. Time? 1 minute. 1 minute. Okay. So, in conclusion, the Cold War was a tumultuous time, a long conflict, and there was many ups and downs in it. But however, in terms of a society where where actual legislation that was oppressing and caused African Americans to be second-hand citizens the civil rights movement was spurred on due to international pressure due to the Cold War by the US wanting allies in Africa. And however, these allies may have been skeptical of the US and therefore did not want to become allies. However, due to this, the US was pressured to desegregate. Economically, the need for US goods and military equipment throughout the world helped give purpose to an already large and set up infrastructure base and industrial base. And thirdly, through interventionism, the US was able to combat the Soviet Union more directly and perhaps on the military field, and was able to help defend and create states that are now currently democratic and able to determine for themselves, and are able to become and are allies of the United States economically and politically. So, the United States, just to recap, has achieved the largest economy in the world, the strongest military, a large web of allies and trade partners, and instituted laws prohibiting segregation and discrimination of all races and religions. With all these facts and all these points, one can firmly say that the Cold War changed the United States for the better in many ways, and that though there were some mistakes, that the Cold War did in fact influence the United States in its society for the better, its economy for the better, and through interventionism did increase global stability and benefited not only the United States but all of its allies throughout the Cold War and to this very day. Thank you.